Today I want to do something a little bit different and talk about Veterans Day. The real reason that we actually celebrate the day, which is quite unbelievable, but absolutely true. This is one story amongst thousands of stories about World War I, but this one specifically actually ties in one of those really interesting questions that you probably asked yourself at some point, like who was the last person to die in a major war? Well, we actually have the answer to that, and he was an American. This story ties together how a gun, one letter, timing, fate, and everything led to what we eventually know as Veterans Day. And as sad as it is, I think it should be remembered. It's an incredible one. It's got almost everything in this story. If it hasn't been made into a movie by now, it should be, because it is quite literally unbelievable, but true. So I'm going to share this with you, man, and big thanks to all veterans out there, past and present, that have served us. Big thank you to what you've done for me, my family, and for the rest of us, so we can live over here in peace. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Now, this story is about Henry Gunther. He's a 23-year-old from Baltimore, and he's a bank clerk. Right? So a lot of these guys that joined the war, they're not like born, heroes or generals. They're just regular people. And, Henry didn't even enlist at first when World War I started. He actually got drafted, I think, in September of 1917. The war, or at least America entered the war in April of 1917. Now, the thing with Henry, his parents were actually German. So a lot of Germans at the time, or German Americans, were catching heat from other Americans. They thought, hey, they're disloyal, you can't trust them, etc., etc. But Henry stood up, he did his part. Now, he was really quickly recognized for having exceptional organization skills. So he got promoted to supply leader. Now, that's a really important part of the story, at least it will be here in a minute when I tell you what eventually happened to him. But here's the thing, like most soldiers, right, war seems more glorious from the outside, but when you're actually there, it doesn't take much of an imagination to know that these guys were living literally in hell on earth. So what he did is he vented, right, like any soldier would. He talked about the conditions, the constant bombing, the lack of food. He even told one of his friends, do anything you can to not get enlisted. The problem is that letter got intercepted by military censors. Now, these censors would actually go through random pieces of mail to make sure that soldiers weren't giving away vital intel. But they also wanted to make sure that nobody was sending out letters that would hurt morale for people to enlist. We needed people to go over there, and they saw this as a major infraction on Henry. And so essentially his commander demoted him, right? He went from supply sergeant to private once again, and he was put on the front lines. Now imagine that. You have your sergeant stripes stripped from you. You're demoted all the way down, back down to private, and now your buddies probably see you a little bit different, maybe even treat you a little different. And there's stories that this actually had a rippling effect. There was actually a story that said that his fiance at the time actually canceled their engagement. That was actually found out to be not true. They just postponed it because of the war. But of course, Gunther never came back, and actually his fiance never married. Her name was Olga Grubel, and she died in 1964. But his comrades saw an immediate shift in how Gunther acted. He was withdrawn, and the biggest thing to him is he had to prove a point now, right? He's no German sympathizer, and he's definitely no coward. But leading up to the end of World War I, he was trying to prove a point. Now, when the Meuse-Argonne offensive happened in France, we had like 1 million troops fighting in this offensive effort. Gunther signed up for increasingly dangerous jobs, and they needed runners, right, to go back and forth to carry messages between command posts. This is something Gunther wanted to do. Eventually, he got shot in the hand. He wrapped him up. He got shot in the wrist. He kept going. Like I said, he was going to prove to everybody that he earned those stripes, and he was going to get those stripes back one way or the other. And he did, but unfortunately it came a little bit too late. November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m., of course, officially is when the armistice was signed. But his commanders told him to keep pushing until then. Now, the Germans knew the fighting was over. The Americans knew that the fighting was coming to an end, But again, Gunther had something to prove. And so him and his unit actually came across a German machine gun post, or at least a German position that of course had machine gunners. Now, according to the reports, Germans didn't want to fire and the Americans were calling Gunther back. But he kept charging on. And supposedly the Germans actually were trying to tell him, hey, halt, stop, this is over, right? This is literally about to be over, but he did not stop. And that's when one of the rounds struck him in the temple. He fell instantly, and that's where he actually died. And then, of course, 60 seconds later, the war ends. It's over. That's why we celebrate Veterans Day in the 11th month on the 11th day. But 11 a.m. was the official end of World War I as well. Now remember, that train car where the armistice was signed would become very important in World War II as well. That's where France would then concede to Germany, and Hitler himself made sure to use that very same car the Germans gave themselves up to, surrendered in. He made sure to use it back against the French in that situation, but of course that's a story for another day. Now, the story goes that either Gunther couldn't hear his unit yelling at him, or he just chose not to listen. But like I said, he was there to prove a point, and he wasn't the only one that passed away that morning. Actually, there was 2,700 officially that died between 5 a.m. and 11 a.m. Now, the Germans were told to hold their positions. You don't needlessly need to, kill anyone. But the Americans told their guys, hey, you keep pushing on. And so it's a pretty unfortunate end to World War I, including the wounded and the missing in action. I think it raised those numbers to like 11 or 13,000. It was a pretty deadly end to World War I. Now, Lieutenant Jonidas was actually the Catholic priest in the unit, and he helped dig the grave for Gunther. Eventually, he was exhumed from France and brought back over to Baltimore. Lieutenant Jonidas is the same one that went to Baltimore to tell his family, his fiancée, about what happened to him and his heroism. The Army posthumously actually returned his rank back to sergeant, along with the Distinguished Service Cross. And these are things that he desperately wanted to get back in life, but unfortunately it took a death and an incredible, tragic ending in order for him to get those honors back. I mean, this is an incredible story. And by the way, it was originally called Armistice Day, became an official federal holiday, I think in the 30s. And then in 1954, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed it to actually change it over to Veterans Day, right? Because then you had World War II and the Korea War that happened since World War I. But either way, an absolutely incredible story about bravery, fate, timing, an unfortunate demotion, and how that led to an untimely death of an absolute American hero. There you go, man. I hope you guys appreciate this story as much as I do. Like I said, it almost has everything in it for one of the most incredibly tragic stories and the real reason that we celebrate Veterans Day. And I don't want that to ever be forgotten, because it's about the people that actually fought these wars and unfortunately the people that died as well. That's the reason that you're sitting right now watching your phone, hopefully in peace. Big thanks to you guys. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.